their rulings. These individuals, let's say about them, that they say that a narrator is sound. And then I have one or two of those who are harsh. They say that he's weak. Why would I take? So over there, I would give preference to them. Why? I feel the chairs are too close. Like, yeah, I think we just if we get rid of the front row, we'll be okay. So over here, if I have one group, if I have someone from these group of scholars who we consider to be harsh or we call harsh, and they're saying that a narrator is weak, but we have the rest of the mu'addilin, we have the rest of them who say that that this person is actually sound, what happens? We said that we give preference to them. Taib. Why? Because his standards are higher, right? So when we talk about somebody being mutashaddid, it means that their standards are higher. And these are examples of them. So you have like Shu'bah, Al-Qattan, Ibn Ma'in, Abu Hatim, Nasa'i, Ibn Hibban. These are known to be harsh critics, meaning that they have somewhat higher standards. Taib. But if I have Shu'bah saying about someone, for example, kadhab, that he's a liar, would I reject him saying that, oh, he's harsh and he has higher standards? No. Why? Right, lying is lying. Right? Like, regardless of where you stand. Yeah. So okay, well, what if I have like maybe 3 or 4 of them all agree on a ruling, and then I have one or two over here that disagree? Right. So it's at that point it's not as qualitative sometimes as we make these different issues. That it's not as clear. Just because I have some mutashaddidin or those who are considered to be harsh make a particular ruling, it doesn't mean that I every single time reject the ruling, but it means that I have to take their bias into account when it actually comes to make a ruling on a particular narrator. So, and not just that, is it possible that someone who we consider to be more objective, is it possible that sometimes you make us a harsh ruling? Yeah. Right. Absolutely. Right. So, and not just that, somebody, a critic who's harsh, is it sometimes that he makes a more objective ruling? Yes. Right. This is just their general inclination, and that's all it is, and that's all that it's discussing, and that's important to understand that. You have some scholars who have described, like Ibn Hibban and Al-Iji, as lenient, and these are for 2 separate reasons. So basically, for Ibn Hibban, what happened is that he has a book called Al-Thiqat. We had mentioned this, and I think we talked about it before. And in this book, Al-Thiqat, what he's done is he's got all of these narrators, and in some of those narrators that he mentions in that book, some of them are majahil, some of them are unknown narrators. So some scholars have said, oh, look, he put unknown narrators in his book of Thiqat. This means that those narrators are Thiqa, right? To him, his standard is that. That is not what is meant. Basically, what his reasoning, and Allah knows best, behind including some of those narrators in his book, that I couldn't find what? I'm sorry? Like, I couldn't find any criticism. That's all that means. It means I couldn't find any criticism about these narrators, which is why I've included them here. Is it possible that the book was meant to be 2 stages, meaning that the first stage, what he did was like he gathered all of these like as a rough copy and a rough draft and be like, okay, let me gather everyone who doesn't have any clear criticism about them, and I'm going to gather them into this book, and then from there I can sift them further. If I really want to know Ibn Hibban's rulings, what I can do is I can go to his Sahih. Right, he has a book called Sahih Ibn Hibban, and basically, why did he include those hadith in his book? What was his condition? That they be Sahih. His condition was that they be Sahih, meaning that if he has a narrator in that book, then that means that he thinks that narrator is sound, right? That he's an acceptable narrator. Yes. Mm-hmm. No. If he has no criticism, but what if I don't know the narrator? No. No. If he's unknown, we don't accept the narration. Yeah. If so, here, there are layers, right? So if I have someone like, for example, I know their name, and I know that they're a poet, does that mean that I know he's a sound narrator? No, it doesn't mean anything. It just means I know him, I know his profession, I might have known where he lived and where he died, but it tells me nothing about his ability to narrate. So this is it's very similar to a break in a chain, and it doesn't give me enough information to actually make a final ruling. Yeah. Hmm. Absolutely. I mean, again, it's definitely possible because the thing is, like, he has a sahih. What's interesting is, like, the way he actually organizes sahih is a little bit different than some of the scholars before him. His sahih is actually called a taqasim wal anwa. It's basically called, um, what's a good way of translating that? Like, categories and types, right? That's what he titled his book. And the reason that he titled his book categories and types is that he actually he actually organizes his book into 5 categories. What do you think those categories are? So those 5 categories are obligations, prohibitions, recommendations, what else? Things that are disliked, and things that are what? Mubah, right? Things that are permissible. So if I open up Ibn Hibban's book, I can immediately understand what ruling he wants me to take from that particular hadith. And this is good when we get to takhrij, like, so when we actually talk about referencing and sourcing. If someone says, okay, rawahu Ibn Hibban, like, this is an obligation because of this hadith in Ibn Hibban, what is a way that I can respond to that person? Yeah, so he's challenging me. He's coming to me and he's like, "Hey, listen, well, you have to do XYZ action." I was like, "Okay, well, why do you have to do it?" Because there's a hadith in Ibn Hibban, and the hadith says that you have to do this. I'd be like, "Okay, where did he categorize it? Right? What category did he put it in? Right? Huh? So, because the thing is, are there certain things? The Prophet ﷺ, is every order meant to be an obligation? No, right? It might be. There's something else. It might be a recommendation, right? Or it might be something that is permissible. Yeah, for example, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, he says, وَإِذَا حَلَّلْتُمْ فَاصْطَادُوا. He says, when you come out of ihram, then go hunt. There's an order. So am I obligated to hunt after I take ihram off? No. Yes. Hmm. Yeah. Hmm. So sure. Yeah. Okay, so he uses the word yastahillun. Yastahillun doesn't mean to make halal. So the question is, okay, what does that word mean? It means to actually do, to do something. That's very different than saying things are halal and haram. Versus the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, if he said something like naha, he prohibited. If he said ijtanib, to stay away from, this is also a prohibition. If he uses terms like haram, right? If he says that this is impermissible, then these are very clear indications for me that he's intending what? He's attending a ruling here. But if he uses a term like yastahilun, because this is not the only hadith that he uses the term, right? In order for me to understand prophetic language, what do I have to do? Well, not just I have to study what? Well, no, Arabic is part of it, but because Arabic, even a word, is it possible that words are used in different meanings depending on how it is in a sentence? Yes. Yeah, for example, a sleeve. We all know what a sleeve is in English. Yes. If I said I'm about to roll up my sleeves, what does that mean? Does that mean that I'm physically going to roll up my sleeves, or does it mean I'm about to start working? Right. Right. Or we're going to start a fight. Right. So there are uses that we have in the language, even though you might have certain terms. So here, if the Prophet ﷺ is saying something, how do I understand what he's saying? I need context, right? So how do I get context? What I can do is I can take all of the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ and do what? I can compare. And I say, okay, every place where he says yastahillun, what can I do? Right? And then after I gather all of those instances of yastahillun, of where he said what is translated as to make halal, right? But my challenge to that is that I think that's an incorrect translation. Because if you look at other hadith, he says those for things that are already permissible. So the word means to do. To do, right? That's what's intended. And how do you know that? By taking a survey of every time that term is used. So if you have, for example, he sallallahu alaihi wasallam yastahillun al-khaz, as it comes in Abu Dawud. Khaz is like, it's like wool. He said, and the people yastahilun khaz. Does it mean that they were making wool halal because it was haram before? No. Right? So it's important to understand, okay, how is terminology used? And the only way for me to understand how terminology and how words are used, I have to take a survey of every use of that particular word. And then I can come to a conclusion on what that word actually means. Even though, and the other thing that we do many times, the thing that we do many times, and I'll give a very simple example. The Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he said, "Man yuridillahu bihi khayran yufaqihu fid din." Right? Whoever Allah intends good for, He gives him fiqh of the religion. Like, what does fiqh mean? Fiqh means, oh, the science that you study to help you understand halal and haram that is taken from. Is that what it means? No. No, it means understanding for sure. But this, what? How do we use fiqh today? In this meaning, right? Like, it means the things that are halal and haram, and like how to extract, how to extract rulings, etc., etc. So, but if I take my use and I inject it to the Prophet ﷺ statement, what have I done? This is called back projection. So it doesn't work. It doesn't work. Why? Because the way that he ﷺ is using it and the way that I use it is going to be different. Another very common use, like, and do words, do their meanings change? Yeah, absolutely. The word salah, it's an Arabic term, yes. Did the Quran invent it? Like, did all of a sudden this word salah just show up in Arabic? No. Right. It's a term that was pre-Islamic. Yes? Would you agree? Did it mean that, a combination of ruku' and sujood and making dua and particular rest? Is that what the pagan Arabs, they say? When the pagan Arab, he says ana usalli, like, or ana sa'usalli, like, if the pagan Arab says I am going to go and make salah, what does he mean? Does he mean that Allahu Akbar? Huh? What does he mean? Well, pray to them, it means dua. Like, so the word salah, it actually means dua. Right? That's the linguistic meaning to it. So again, and the reason I'm mentioning all of these examples is to show what? That yes, sometimes there are words and terms that are shared, right, throughout history. But is it necessary that that's what that term means in that use? Right? The application is where it comes into play and where it's important. But khair. Anyway, and even with the same hadith, Abu Dawud actually, he uses the same hadith in his sunnah, and he doesn't use it concerning music either. So the question then comes, all right, well, if he has a chapter that's karahiyatul ghina, right? He has a chapter about the dislikedness of music. Why didn't he include that hadith if he thought that's what it meant? Even though he's clearly aware of it, because he mentions the hadith in another place. That has to do with it has to do with wearing harir, wearing silk. So these are important things to keep in mind to help us understand terminology, to help us engage with prophetic statements. So going back to what Ibn Hibban, his book, Taqasim al-Anwa, there is a scholar who came later. His name was, he was a Persian scholar. He actually reorganized Ibn Hibban's Sahih. Ibn Balban. So Ibn Balban, he actually has a work that he does later, and this is, I would say, probably up until about 5 to 7 years ago or so. His was the one that was famous, right? So Ibn Balban, what he did is he reorganized all of Sahih Ibn Hibban into different chapters. Like, so, the fiqh chapters that we're familiar with. So if you read like Sunan Abu Dawud or you read like Sunan Nasa'i, how are they organized, right? It's like Kitab al-Tahara, and then Abwab al-Sal, Bab al-Wudu, Bab al Siwak, like, what I mean? It mentions all those things. Ibn Balban did the same thing. So he took Ibn Hibban's book, he took all of his hadith, he reorganized it into these fiqh chapters, and that was the work that was actually familiar. A lot of work was done on that, and a lot of people used it in that way. The shortcoming in that is that I have removed what? I removed something. I removed Ibn Hibban's ruling. Right? Right. The categories were very clear, but what I've done is I've actually removed it, and because now I've categorized it into these fiqh rulings. Uh-huh. Yeah. Yeah, yeah, subhanAllah. It's and not just that, it gives us an idea into like the fiqh of some of the muhaddithin, right? It gives us an idea into the fiqh of some of the muhaddithin. Yeah. Hmm. Yes. Well, scholar of fiqh. A scholar of fiqh, you mean? Yes. Hmm. Yes. So Ibn Hibban was which madhab? Do you know? He was Shafi'i. And guess which scholar combined fiqh and hadith? Imam Shafi'i. Very, yeah, he was well known. And even Imam Ahmad, that's one of the reasons he praised Imam Shafi'i. He was with a companion, and I think Ali ibn Medini or like Abdullah ibn Mubarak, they were like narrating a hadith or something. And he was like he said to Ahmed, he was like, come on man, let's go get the higher isnad. Let's go get a shorter chain from him. And he was like, listen, if I miss out on the higher chain, I can still find it in a lower with someone else narrating it. He's like, but what Shafi'i has, you're not gonna find with you're not gonna find with anyone else. So and this is something that was well known from Imam Shafi'i, that he actually combined the madrasat al-fiqh and madrasat al-hadith. Um, and Ibn Hibban, like I said, very famously Shafi'i. So it's not strange for him to kind of combine like this usuli and hadithi type of blend in the way that he does it, and it's a beautiful way to show. And he's not the only one. So and not like even like pre-development like formalization of the madhahib. For example, if you go through like Imam Bukhari Sahih, right? He has very clear intentions on what he feels the ruling should be and what he feels the understanding should be of those particular hadith. So if I want to know, and my mashayikh used to say this all the time, if I want to know the fiqh of Imam Bukhari, what would I do? I'd read the chapter headings. And from the chapter headings, I would actually get the understanding what Imam Bukhari actually intended and what he meant to extract from those particular hadith. The second one, Al-Ijli. Al-Ijli is, again, this is a more modern phenomenon. I don't know why it came about, but the scholars of the past, they didn't say the same thing. They didn't say he was a mutasahil. Imam Muallimi, he probably died, like, I want to say 40 years ago, 50 years ago. He says in his Fuad al-Majmu' that whoever becomes famous for being lenient or harsh is not meant to be in an absolute sense. And it's at the end of the quote. Basically, he's saying that just because somebody is described as being lenient, or just because somebody is described as being harsh, it doesn't mean that every single instance is what? Right, it's not an expression of that. It's not meant to be that. They have different standards, right? Not different standards. I would say they would have higher standards than some of the other scholars, right? So you find this is why they're described generally to be harsh. But saying that, it's like if we understand that this is a particular bias or this is a particular leaning of that scholar, it's not something that is meant to reject his statements. It's only something that is to be taken account when there is a difference of opinion concerning a particular narrator. And sometimes there's a usage of terms that comes into play. So you will have a tendency toward harshness, which is why they're called harsh, and sometimes the terminology they'll use. So there's two reasons that a hadith critic would be called harsh. One of the reasons is that you'll find that there's a leaning toward that. There's a leaning toward that. So even in the mistaken rulings, you'll find that there's a leaning toward that harshness or toward that stringiness. And then you'll have sometimes they'll use certain terms that some people will take off. Like, so for example, the term suduq, which means honest, versus thiqa, which is trustworthy. We said thiqa is a higher standing, right? It's a higher position than suduq. But he'll use the term suduq and they'll say, oh, look, he's using the lesser term to show something that is higher. Why is he doing that? Because of his high standard, which isn't not always the case. So like we said, there's no reason to reject their rulings. They're meant to be supporting evidences when we understand how to justify particular rulings and how to deal when we have a difference of opinion. These are supporting evidences that we always look at when we deal with how to make a ruling on a particular narrator. The number of people that have criticized or the number of people that have praised. That's something that's extremely important. The status of the one making that praise. If I have an imam praising someone versus someone who does not have the same status, like does that have the same value? The objectivity, again, is that scholar considered to be from those who are mu'addil or those who are mutashaddid? The timeline. So we had talked about and mentioned very quickly that the classical scholars, they had tools available to them and they had resources available to them that later scholars just didn't have. The locality. So if I live in the same land as someone and I'm criticizing them versus somebody who maybe lived far away and is not criticizing that person, I would try to give preference to the person who lives there. Descriptions, how strong the descriptions. So sometimes they'll use terms like thiqatun labt. Yani, so they'll say things like he is trustworthy and extremely precise. Right? So you have not just that, you'll have like repetition and sometimes you'll have emphasis on the status of that person, which actually gives value. So sometimes you have this bias. So for example, if they're critiquing an individual, sometimes that bias can come into play, whether it be harsh or whether or not. If I hear from a peer, so for example, if you said that, oh, he's abandoned. You have one scholar who says he's abandoned, and there's another scholar in that same town, in that same locality. They know each other, and he knows of his ruling, and he says he's thiqa. What does that mean? That he didn't accept, right? He didn't accept the ruling. He didn't accept the ruling for whatever reason, right? For whatever reason, he didn't accept that ruling. It's important to understand what is going on. So sometimes there's certain terminology that's used that is not 100% clear. So we need to make sure that we're understanding that in the correct way so we can arrive to the right ruling. This is one of the things that we had mentioned, like this awareness, unsurety. So sometimes you'll have a scholar is unsure about a particular narrator, right? Like he'll hear good things and he'll hear bad things. That unsurety is something that is telling to us because it'll allow me to reach a final ruling and reach a final conclusion about an individual. Sometimes the comparisons like huwa adaf minhu or ahfad minhu, awthaq minhu. So you'll have terms like he's more honest, he's more trustworthy, he's more upright, he's more precise than him. But those comparisons aren't meant to be rulings. And that's something that's important. They're not meant to be rulings in and of themselves. So without exploring further evidences, we always assume that the critic is being just, regardless, right? Even if they have a particular leaning, none of them is going to lie. They're considered imams. They're considered upright. They're considered individuals who tried to be and work their hardest to be just. And there's usually a number of ways that there are a number of ways we can actually verify that. And sometimes you can't make a ruling, right? It's very difficult to come to a conclusion about how to make a ruling on a particular narrator. So the last step that happens is this idea of tawaqquf. Like I just don't have enough information to differentiate. So if I can't give preference, like if I can't tell, like I just have a balance of opinions, or sometimes the balance of weight, right? So I have an imam who's praising him and an imam that's disparaging him. What do? Right? It becomes tough. Like you can't really sometimes you can't really tell. Sometimes I can't find any evidence, right? I don't have enough supporting evidence to bring a final ruling or to make a final ruling in a particular issue. So if I have one imam, how do I make sure that that's actually what he said, right? I need to make sure what he says is authentic. So we had talked about this and we had mentioned this before, that one way of exploring that is to do what? No, the authenticity. So I have to make sure that the imam said it. So what do? Have to look at the chain of narration. So even Jarh wa Ta'dil, even the statements of Jarh wa Ta'dil, they have their own chain. Yeah, they have their own chains so that it can be verified that that particular imam actually said and it can be ascribed to him. The timeline, we had talked about this before in a different context, but in this context, if I have any imam very early on, he says that, you know, he's good, and then later in his life I find out he's like, no, he says like this person should be abandoned. Which one do I give preference to? The earlier ruling or the later one? I give preference to the later ruling, right? Because there's some information that he came across later on that he now changed his ruling. Tarjih, sometimes I have enough information to make an informed decision, meaning that I'm able to, even though I have two rulings, I actually have an information to choose one or to give preference to another. And like we said, tawaqquf, right? So if I'm unable to reconcile any of these things, I can actually suspend a ruling, and that's something that's completely fine. So these are the things that we had mentioned and that we had looked at before. looking at the number, looking at the stronger students, looking at later students, right? Looking at later students gives me a timeline of when a scholar made a particular ruling, which is why it's given preference. And subjectivity, right? Looking at the statements of other scholars and making sure that it's either falling in line or if it's something that's different than other scholars had mentioned. So here's probably the last section that we'll be talking about and discussing, inshallah. But this is maratib al-jarh wa ta'dil. Basically, there are different terms that the scholars used. What is it that they meant by those particular terms? So not all terms are created equal. And just because there's a term that's used, it doesn't mean that there's necessarily like a fixed per se category. There's a general category that it falls into and a general theme, but it's not necessary that has a particularly fixed meaning. Yes. Mm-hmm. Sure. Okay, that's a valid question. The terms or the terminology in jarh wa ta'dil, where is it meant to be used? I'm asking. Where do I use it? If I say he's trustworthy, he's not, he's this, where do I use the terminology? Narrators. That's it. It applies to narrators. It doesn't apply to anyone else. If an individual is a narrator, that's where jarh wa ta'dil comes in. It doesn't come in when I'm dealing with other people. Dealing with other people, how I deal with them, that's going to be up to my dealing. But calling somebody names or something, labeling someone, that's not what jarh wa ta'dil is for. Jarh wa ta'dil is to help me determine what, where if this person qualifies to narrate or not. That's all. And when it comes to disbelievers, are disbelievers narrating anything from the religion? No, right? That's one of the first disqualifiers, that this person cannot narrate religion. Why? Because he's not part of that religion. So jarh wa ta'dil is very specific for narrators, and it's meant to be in the realm of narrators. There are different uses. There are different general applications to this, and these are things that are important to keep in mind. So the term misguided, can come across as deceptive. So if we say dal, for example, I would assume that misguided means what? That the narrator is? I'm sorry? That he's misguided. If somebody's described as misguided, would I want to take his hadith? No. So he actually got lost in his travels. Lal. And this is the word in Arabic, right? Lal. That he got lost in his travels and he became described as misguided. Yani that he got lost. No, he was traveling and he got lost. So he just became famously known as the guy who got lost. Good. I would assume what? His narrations are good. They're accepted. Even though the narrator is weak. Why? Because it's not necessary that he's talking about him as a narrator, but he might be talking about him as a person. Somebody who's a great memorizer. The same thing, right? We would assume. Right? He's correct. But and you can say that he was a great memorizer, but the problem wasn't in his memory, it was in his trustworthiness. Worshipper, abid. This is something, again, we would consider it's a good thing, it's a praise, or even ascetic, but they were weak in their precision. So a person can be described as an abid. So you see, sometimes these terms, if we, right, so and not just that, it's using them within the context. And it's understanding how to use them within the context. Just because I have these particular descriptions of them, it doesn't prevent them from other descriptions. Can a person be a worshiper but have weak memory? Absolutely. Can a person have great memory but not be particularly practicing? Absolutely, right? So all of these possibilities are definitely there, and it's important to understand them within the subject and understand them within the context. Sure. No, like within one category, it helps you, it kind of helps you place them, but that doesn't mean that we're done analyzing that particular narrator. So tasheeh. Tasheeh is considered the highest level of authenticity. And the next level of authenticity would be tahseen. So between tasheeh and tahseen, there are different levels, and it's important to keep those in mind. Some terms that are used for tasheeh, like sometimes we exaggerate the praise of that person. So, for example, they'll say things like Amir al-Mu'mineen fil Hadith. Sometimes they'll say things like thiqatun dhabt. Sometimes they'll say thiqatun thiqa, right? So they'll repeat terms, or sometimes they'll use certain terminology to actually talk about how high this individual's status is. Sometimes they'll use words like adl. Sometimes they'll use words like mu'addil. Sometimes they'll use other terms that are not as strong, but still within the category of accepted, not just accepted, like highly accepted or authentic narrators. Less than this, you have terms like suduq, like somebody who's honest, right? But somebody who's honest, it's not necessary that their memory is particularly precise. You'll have words like la ba's bihi or laysa fi shay, or you know what I mean, like, so along these lines, jayyid al-hadith. So these are a little bit lesser than that. Suwaydiq is like small, like somebody who's I like kind of honest, or I don't know how to translate that, but like sadiq and suwaydiq. So sadiq is somebody who's truthful. Suwaydiq would be like somebody who's small, right? Like, yeah. Ambivalence. So there are 3 levels to this, right? Or there are 3 things to keep in mind when we talk about this, is that they can indicate acceptance or rejection, right? So this is the middle level. And we said that in general, there are 3 levels, right? There's acceptance, there's accepting with conditions, and rejection. So within this, there are different ways that this can be dealt with. So number 1, that if we say that he's not, like we know he's not extremely weak, meaning that he's weak, and if others like him narrate the hadith can be raised. So so they'll say things like ruwi anhu, like it's been narrated on him, like people narrated it from him, or huwa rawa an, like he narrated from others. Tahammalu, uktub hadithu, write his hadith. So you have these like general types of terminologies that don't necessarily give like a clear ruling, like, you know, like, yeah, like he's not rejected, but he's not completely accepted either, type of thing. There here multiple characterizations. So for example, ghafla, like, or somebody who does talqeen, like if you say something to him, say this, and then he'll say it, and then you'll narrate it to him. That you have these type of instances that definitely do happen, and then you have unique scenarios, like, so you have the mukhtalit and the mudallis. The mukhtalit, we said, is somebody who what? The mukhtalit, somebody, what happened to him? We have a ruling, and then the ruling changed. Something happened where his hadith became weak, right? So this is, right, there's some trauma, something happened in his life. And then the next one is the mudallis. Mudallis is the one who removes the intermediary. In terms of rejection, so you have light weakness and you have extreme weakness. So light weakness, layyin fil hadith, and he's like soft in his hadith, or huwa kadha wa kadha, like he's like that. You know, so these are kind of like these are the types of terms that you would come across in these hadith. Laysa bi hujja, like he's not approved. Like, so these are indicate terms of rejection, but they're not extreme rejection. Is like, you probably want to avoid his hadith. And then you have levels of extreme weakness. So matruk, like abandoned, dhahib, or muttarih, like, he's thrown enemy B, like throws a hadith against the wall. So you'll have these types of statements that actually indicate it. And then you have like the lie, like the last level here. So you'd say who akdhab an-nas, like he's the biggest liar. You'll have things like who ad-dajjal, like he's a dajjal, or you say ad-dajjal min ad-dajjajila, like he's one of the dajjals. Rukn min arkan al-kadhib, that like lies actually are founded upon this person, right? So you have these like harsh terms that are indicative of a complete rejection of these people's hadith. But that's it. These are the last set of discussions on the jarh wa ta'dil. Inshallah, the next section, I'm still contemplating on how to move forward in the hadith. So I'm not sure if I want to explain a book next, or if I want to start talking about referencing. But inshallah, we'll see how it goes. We'll start the next class in about 5-10 minutes or so. بإذن الله تعالى والله أعلم وصلى الله على خير خلق نبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم.